They said Clara Whitmore would rather grow old alone than let another man sit in her husband's chair, and for 2 long years, the whole town believed it. Every Saturday evening, men came through the swinging doors of Miller's saloon smelling of horse leather, cedar smoke, and cheap cologne, carrying flowers, silver bracelets, even folded deeds to land they thought might soften her heart, but none of it ever worked. Clara always sat in the same corner beneath the oil lamp near the frosted window, dressed in black from collar to boots no matter the season, one hand wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold hours earlier, and beside her sat that empty chair. Nobody touched it. Nobody asked about it anymore. Folks in Dry Creek had learned silence the hard way. Outside, wind pushed dust across Main Street in long pale ribbons while hitching posts creaked beneath tired horses, and inside the saloon, piano music stumbled lazily through cigarette haze and low conversation. Then came Walter Graves first, richest banker within 50 miles. Polished boots, gold watch chain across his vest. He walked to Clara's table carrying a bouquet wrapped in newspaper from Denver and gave the kind of smile money teaches a man to wear. "Evening, Clara," he said softly. "Thought maybe tonight you'd finally say yes." Every eye in the saloon lifted toward her. Clara did not even look up right away. She took one slow sip of coffee, set the cup down gently, then answered with a voice quiet enough to make the room lean closer. "No, Walter." The banker's smile froze. Someone near the bar coughed into his whiskey. Walter nodded once like a man trying not to bleed pride onto the floorboards, then walked away beneath the weight of 20 watching faces. 10 minutes later came Sheriff Tom Avery, broad-shouldered and decent, holding his hat respectfully against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, "I could take care of you proper." Clara stared at the empty chair beside her before answering. "I know you could." For 1 second the sheriff almost smiled. Then she added, "But I don't want you to." The smile disappeared. By now even the piano had stopped. Men drank slower when Clara Whitmore spoke. Folks had seen droughts break easier than that woman's silence. Near midnight, young rancher Billy Tate tried next, nervous enough to nearly trip over his own boots. He couldn't have been older than 25. "Mrs. Whitmore," he stammered, "I just figured maybe nobody should eat supper alone forever." Clara finally looked him in the eyes then, and for a moment the sadness there almost frightened him. "Sometimes," she whispered, "alone is the only thing that stays." Billy backed away as red as sunset clay while laughter rolled quietly through the saloon, not cruel exactly, just uncomfortable, the sound people make when they don't know where to place their pity. After that, nobody moved. Nobody dared. Clara remained still beneath the oil light, her dark hair pinned neatly beneath a black ribbon, silver wedding band catching the glow each time her fingers touched the coffee cup. The empty chair beside her seemed heavier than furniture. It felt like a gravestone standing upright in the middle of the room. Then the front door opened again. Cold wind drifted inside, carrying the smell of rain somewhere far off beyond the plains. Most folks barely looked at first. Another cowboy. Another drifter. Dry Creek saw dozens every month. But this one stepped quietly, almost carefully, boots dusty from miles of trail, long brown coat faded pale at the shoulders from years under hard sun. He removed his hat before the door even closed behind him, revealing streaks of gray near his temples and eyes too tired for a man who couldn't have been much past 40. He did not swagger, did not scan the room looking for trouble or whiskey or women. He simply crossed the saloon slowly, hearing every whisper rise around him as he passed. Probably another fool. Poor bastard doesn't know. Give her 30 seconds. Clara noticed him only when his shadow touched the edge of her table. He stood there calmly, hat in both hands, dust still clinging to his sleeves. Up close, she could see the faint scar near his jawline, and the exhaustion settled deep behind his eyes, the kind that sleep never fixes. The cowboy glanced once at the empty chair beside her. Not greedy, not curious, just noticing it the way a man notices weather. Then he asked the question nobody else had ever asked. "Can I sit with you?" The entire saloon went silent so fast the piano player froze mid-note. Somewhere near the kitchen, a glass hit the floor and shattered. Walter Graves let out a dry laugh under his breath. Clara did not answer immediately. She looked at the cowboy for a long moment while wind rattled the windows behind him. Most men stared at her like they wanted something. Land. Beauty. A wife. This one looked at her like he understood something. That frightened her more than the others ever had. "You deaf, cowboy," someone called from the bar. "That chair belongs to a ghost." A few men chuckled nervously. The stranger ignored them. He waited quietly, patient as old stone. Clara's fingers tightened around the coffee cup. For 2 years no soul had touched that chair. Not after Caleb died. Not after the funeral. Not after winter nearly buried the whole valley in snow while she sat alone staring at that empty seat night after night. People thought the chair was for mourning. Truth was, Clara kept it empty because letting someone fill it felt too much like betrayal. Yet standing before her now was a man who asked nothing except permission to share the silence. Outside, thunder rolled low beyond the prairie. Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward him again. Then, before her courage could fail, she reached out with one hand and gently pulled the empty chair away from the table. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Sit." And for the very first time in 2 years, nobody in Dry Creek could remember how to breathe. The strange thing was not that Clara Whitmore let the cowboy sit down. The strange thing was that she did not ask him to leave. In Dry Creek, silence always meant something. And by the time the clock behind the bar crept past midnight, every soul inside Miller's saloon understood they had just witnessed something the town would be talking about for years. The cowboy settled carefully into the chair beside her, setting his weathered hat on his knee instead of the table like a man raised with manners too old for most places anymore. Up close, the smell of rain and trail dust clung to his coat. His hands looked rough enough to split firewood barehanded, but he moved slowly, gentle around the edges, almost like he was afraid to disturb the ghosts sitting there with her. Clara stared down at her coffee, while whispers floated through the room behind them like smoke. She finally lost her mind. Probably feels sorry for him. That drifter does not even own a horse worth stealing. Walter Graves remained near the bar pretending not to listen, but his jaw tightened every time someone chuckled. The cowboy ignored all of it. He glanced once toward the window where lightning flickered far beyond the prairie, then calmly asked the waitress for black coffee. His voice carried low and even, deep enough to sound older than his years. Clara noticed he never once asked her name. That alone unsettled her more than the staring. Men always asked her name first, even when they already knew it. They liked hearing themselves say it. Clara Whitmore. Widow Whitmore. Owner of the Whitmore Ranch north of the creek. Beautiful Clara. Lonely Clara. The woman with the empty chair. But this man simply sat beside her like loneliness was already introduction enough. The waitress brought his coffee in a chipped white mug. He thanked her quietly, wrapping both hands around the cup to warm them. Clara finally looked at him directly for the first time. "You passing through?" she asked. Her voice sounded rusty from lack of use. The cowboy nodded once. "Been passing through most places." "You got a name?" "Elias Boone." He answered simply, without pride. Outside, wind pressed dust against the windows in soft waves while thunder rolled closer now. The piano player finally resumed playing, though softer than before, as if afraid loud music might scare away whatever strange thing had just settled at Clara's table. Elias took one sip of coffee and stared toward the lantern hanging above the bar. Clara noticed the tiredness in his eyes again. Not drunkenness, not bitterness, just weariness. Like a man who had spent too many years riding toward places that never felt like home once he arrived. "Folks around here talk too much," Clara said after a while. Elias gave the faintest shrug. "Talking helps people forget themselves." That answer stayed with her. Most men in Dry Creek spoke to impress a room. This one spoke like he had already made peace with being ignored. Across the saloon, Walter Graves finally stepped forward again, expensive boots striking the floorboards sharp enough to turn heads. He stopped beside their table with a smile stretched thin as paper. "Evening again, Clara," he said. Then his eyes shifted toward Elias. "Cowboy." Elias tipped his head politely, but did not stand. Walter folded his hands behind his back. "You know who this woman is?" "Seems like she can answer for herself," Elias replied. A few men near the poker table coughed to hide grins. Walter's face darkened slightly. Clara deserves stability. A future, not some saddle tramp wandering town to town. Clara closed her eyes for half a second. She had heard versions of this speech for 2 years now. Men always talking about what she deserved as if grief had made her too weak to choose for herself. But before she could speak, Elias calmly set down his coffee cup and looked at Walter for the first time. "Then it sounds like she ought to choose what she wants." No anger. No challenge. Just quiet certainty. Somehow that made the whole saloon even stiller. Walter laughed once under his breath, though there was no humor in it. Careful, cowboy. This town does not have much patience for drifters. Elias nodded lightly. Neither do most towns. Walter stood there another second, waiting for a reaction he never got, then finally turned and walked away toward the bar again. Clara watched him go before speaking softly. You should not have done that. Done what? Embarrassed him. Elias looked puzzled. I do not think silence counts as embarrassment. For the first time in months, the corner of Clara's mouth almost moved toward a smile before she stopped it. Almost. She lowered her gaze quickly, fingers brushing the silver ring still resting on her hand. Elias noticed it, but said nothing. That was another thing she was not used to. Men usually saw the ring as competition, something to erase. But Elias treated it like part of the woman sitting beside him, not an obstacle to remove. The storm finally broke outside just after 1 a.m. Rain hammered the roof hard enough to shake dust from the rafters, while cold air slipped beneath the doors. Folks began gathering coats and hats, hurrying home before the roads turned to mud by morning. Clara remained seated. So did Elias. She could hear rainwater spilling from gutters outside and smell wet earth drifting through the cracks in the walls. It reminded her of the night Caleb died. Spring rain, lantern smoke, a horse returning alone without its rider. Her chest tightened suddenly. Elias noticed her hand trembling near the coffee cup. You all right? He asked gently. Clara swallowed hard and stared toward the storm outside. Rain keeps memories alive. Elias looked down into his coffee for a long moment before answering. Yeah, he said quietly. It does. Something in his voice told her he understood exactly what she meant. Not politely, not sympathetically, truly understood. And somehow that frightened her more than all the men who had begged for her attention these past 2 years. Because grief recognized grief the same way wolves recognized distant howling across dark hills. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. They simply listened to the storm together while the saloon slowly emptied around them. Then finally Clara glanced toward the clock on the wall and realized something strange. For the first time since Caleb died, she had spent an entire evening sitting beside someone without wishing for them to leave. By sunrise, the storm had washed every inch of Main Street clean, but somehow the town still felt dirty with gossip. Dry Creek woke slowly beneath pale gray clouds and the smell of wet cedar drifting from chimneys. And before the church bell rang 8 times, half the county already knew Clara Whitmore had shared a table with a stranger all night long. Men leaned across barber chairs whispering about it, while women paused outside the general store pretending to inspect fabric rolls they had no intention of buying. Folks talked about loneliness the same way they talked about weather out west. Quietly, nervously, like maybe it could spread if you stood too close. Clara heard the whispers before she even reached town that afternoon. Her wagon rolled slowly through muddy streets, horse hooves splashing through puddles left behind by the storm, while people tipped hats and nodded too politely. That was always how she knew rumors were alive. People became kinder when they wanted answers. She tied the wagon outside Miller's saloon and stepped down carefully, black dress brushing against damp wood. The silver ring still rested on her finger. Always the ring first. People noticed that before her eyes now. Inside the saloon, daylight filtered weakly through dusty windows, while coffee boiled somewhere behind the kitchen wall. The place looked smaller during the day, stripped of piano music and whiskey laughter. Clara expected the usual stares when she walked in, but today felt different. Curious instead of pitying. She ignored them all and moved toward her table beneath the oil lamp out of habit. Then she stopped. Elias Boone already sat there. Same chair, same quiet posture. 1 cup of black coffee steaming beside him. Hat resting on the table this time. He looked up as she approached, calm as morning itself. Afternoon, he said. Clara blinked once, surprised by how relieved she felt hearing his voice. You came back. Elias glanced around the saloon. Coffee here is decent. That almost made her smile again. Almost. She sat down slowly across from him, noticing the waitress watching from behind the counter with wide eyes. Clara could practically hear the town inventing stories already. You always this quiet? She asked after a moment. Elias shrugged lightly. Talking too much usually gets a man in trouble. And silence does not. Sometimes. He took another sip of coffee. But silence at least gives you time to think before regret catches up. Clara studied him carefully. Most drifters carried noise around them. Loud boots, loud laughter, loud stories about cattle drives and poker wins, and women left waiting somewhere in Texas or Kansas. Elias carried none of that. He did not try to charm the room, did not try to impress her. The strange part was how comfortable that felt. Outside, wagon wheels rattled past through muddy streets while sunlight slowly broke through clouds in pale streaks. Clara removed her gloves finger by finger, laying them neatly beside her coffee cup. Elias noticed the movement, but kept his eyes respectfully lowered. Another thing unusual about him. Men usually stared at beautiful women because they wanted something. Elias looked away like beauty was private business. "You from around here?" she asked. "No place long enough to call it mine." "You running from something?" Elias looked out the window toward the wet street before answering. "Most folks out west are." Clara expected him to say more. He did not. The silence settled comfortably between them again, interrupted only by distant hammering from somewhere down the block, where carpenters repaired damage from the storm. Finally, the waitress approached carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She clearly did not need to refill yet. "You folks need anything?" she asked eagerly. Clara knew curiosity when she heard it. Elias simply shook his head politely. "We are all right." "We." Such a small word. But hearing it made Clara strangely aware of the empty chair beside her no longer feeling empty at all. The waitress walked away disappointed. Elias glanced toward the door as Walter Graves entered the saloon with two businessmen trailing behind him. The banker stopped cold the moment he saw Clara sitting with the cowboy again. His polished smile returned quickly, but his eyes hardened. Clara felt the shift in the room immediately. Walter approached slowly, coat spotless despite the mud outside. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted warmly. "Beautiful afternoon." Clara nodded once. "Mr. Graves." Walter looked toward Elias with a thin smile. "Still in town, I see." "Looks that way," Elias answered calmly. Walter pulled out a nearby chair, but Clara spoke before he could sit. "That seat is taken." The words landed harder than a gunshot ever could have. Even the bartender stopped wiping glasses. Walter remained frozen halfway down for one long second before slowly straightening again. Clara almost surprised herself. For 2 years, she had protected the empty chair beside her like sacred ground. Now she was protecting the man sitting in it. Walter's smile faded just enough to show the insult reached him deep. "I see," he said quietly. Then his gaze settled on Elias again. "You planning to stay long, cowboy?" Elias leaned back slightly, coffee cup warming his hands. "Never was much good at planning." Walter let out a dry laugh. "That explains the boots." A few nervous chuckles rose from nearby tables. Elias simply glanced down at the mud on his worn leather boots and nodded once. "Rain does that." Clara looked away quickly to hide the smile finally reaching her eyes this time. Walter noticed. And for the first time since Caleb Whitmore died, jealousy crossed another man's face when he looked at Clara. Real jealousy. Not over land or money. Over attention. Walter adjusted his vest sharply. "Well," he muttered, "some people mistake silence for depth." Then he turned and walked toward the back tables with his businessmen. Elias watched him leave before quietly saying, "Seems polite enough." Clara nearly laughed into her coffee. The sound caught in her throat halfway out, soft and rusty from disuse. But Elias heard it. So did half the saloon. Heads turned immediately. Clara Whitmore laughing felt like hearing church bells after a drought. She lowered her eyes again, embarrassed suddenly. "It has been a while," she admitted softly. Elias stared into his coffee another moment before answering. "Yeah." His voice carried something heavy behind it again. "I know the feeling." Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds completely, spilling gold across Main Street and warming the wet boards beneath passing horses. For a brief moment, the whole town looked almost new again. Clara noticed Elias watching the light through the window with distant eyes, like he had spent years riding toward mornings he never quite reached. And somewhere deep inside her chest, beneath all the grief she had protected so carefully, something small and dangerous began waking up again. If you have made it this far into the story, let me know down in the comments where you are watching from. And do not forget to like the video because sometimes the quietest stories leave the deepest marks. For the next 6 days, Elias Boone arrived at Miller's Saloon at exactly the same hour every afternoon, and somehow that became the most talked about thing in Dry Creek. Not because he caused trouble, Not because he drank too much or gambled or flirted with waitresses the way traveling cowboys usually did. It was the opposite. Elias came in quietly, brushed trailed dust from his coat near the door, nodded politely to whoever happened to look his way, then crossed the saloon and sat beside Clara Whitmore like it was the most natural thing in the world. Same chair, same coffee, same silence. By the fourth day, people had started timing him. Mrs. Hargrove from the bakery swore the man appeared every afternoon before the church clock struck 3. The barber claimed Elias only spoke maybe 20 words an hour. One ranch hand even bet 50 cents that Clara would eventually throw him out once the novelty wore off. He lost the money by sunset, because Clara never asked Elias to leave. In fact, something stranger was happening. She had started waiting for him. She hated admitting that to herself most of all. Every afternoon, she arrived 5 or 10 minutes early pretending she needed coffee or pie or somewhere quiet to read her ranch accounts. But her eyes always drifted toward the saloon door whenever footsteps passed outside. The first time Elias arrived late by nearly 15 minutes, Clara caught herself staring at the clock 3 separate times before she realized what she was doing. That realization unsettled her deeply. Grief had become routine these past 2 years. Safe. Predictable. Wake before sunrise. Feed the horses. Check fences. Keep conversation short. Return home before dark. Sit alone beside the empty chair. Repeat. Somewhere along the way, loneliness had stopped feeling painful and started feeling familiar. But Elias Boone disturbed that rhythm without even trying. That afternoon, he finally entered carrying the smell of cedar wood and cold wind on his coat. Clara looked up too quickly before pretending she had not noticed him at all. Elias removed his hat slowly and sat beside her with the tired exhale of a man who had spent the entire morning working outdoors. "You are late," Clara said. Before she could stop herself, Elias glanced toward the clock over the bar. "Guess I am. Thought maybe you left town." He studied her quietly then, almost carefully, and for one dangerous second Clara feared he might notice the concern hidden beneath her words. But Elias simply rested his hat on his knee. "Helped old Mr. Wheeler fix a broken wagon axle outside town," he explained. "Took longer than expected." Clara nodded once, trying to ignore the strange relief warming her chest. "You charged him?" "No, why not?" Elias shrugged lightly. What was already broken. Did not figure his wallet needed to break too. Clara lowered her eyes into her coffee cup so he would not see the smile, threatening to return again. Across the room, several men watched them openly now. Dry Creek had grown addicted to this quiet little mystery unfolding each afternoon beneath the oil lamp. Nobody understood what Clara saw in him. He was not rich, not important, not particularly handsome in the polished way Walter Graves was handsome. Elias looked weathered, worn around the edges by too much road and too many winters sleeping beneath open sky. But there was something steady about him, something safe, like an old porch light still burning during a storm. "You always help strangers?" Clara asked after a while. Elias leaned back slightly in his chair. "Depends. On what? Whether they need helping or attention." Clara turned that answer over silently in her mind. The man spoke like someone who had spent years learning the difference between kindness and performance. Outside, the muddy streets had finally begun drying beneath warm afternoon sun. Horses clopped slowly past the windows while distant hammering echoed from somewhere near the blacksmith shop. The ordinary sounds of Dry Creek drifted around them softly, but at their table time always seemed to move differently somehow. Slower, quieter. Clara noticed Elias never filled silence just because it existed. Most people feared quiet moments. Elias respected them. "You got family somewhere?" she asked carefully. Elias stared toward the window before answering. "Used to." The words landed heavy between them. Clara understood immediately that there would be no more explanation. Strange thing was, she did not feel offended by that. She respected it, because grief recognized grief. Some losses became too sacred for conversation. The waitress approached carrying fresh coffee. "Refill?" she asked brightly. Elias looked toward Clara first before answering. "If she is staying a while." Clara glanced up at him, surprised again by how naturally he included her in simple things. The waitress poured coffee into both cups while pretending not to eavesdrop. "Town says you two barely speak," she joked nervously. Elias thanked her for the coffee without responding. Clara waited until the waitress walked away before murmuring quietly, and yet somehow everybody keeps listening. That earned a small smile from Elias this time, real enough to crease the corners of his tired eyes for just a second. Clara looked away almost immediately afterward because something about seeing that smile made her chest ache unexpectedly. It reminded her too much of who she used to be before widowhood hollowed the color out of her life. Near sunset, Walter Graves entered again, stopping near the doorway when he saw Elias beside Clara as usual. This time the banker did not approach immediately. He simply watched from across the room, expensive coat draped over one arm, while resentment slowly darkened his expression. Clara felt it without even looking directly at him. Elias noticed too. "Your banker friend seems upset," he said calmly. "Walter is not my friend." "No." Clara shook her head slowly. "Walter likes winning things." Elias studied her carefully after that. "And what are you?" he asked quietly. Clara looked toward the empty space beside their table, where another chair once used to sit, before finally answering in almost a whisper. "Something he cannot buy." Elias did not speak for several seconds. Then very gently, almost too softly to hear above the piano music drifting through the saloon, he said, "Good." The words settled deep inside her chest like warm whiskey on a cold night. Clara suddenly realized she could no longer remember the last afternoon she spent thinking about death instead of tomorrow. And that realization frightened her far more than loneliness ever had. By the second week, Dry Creek had stopped pretending not to notice them. The town watched Clara Whitmore and Elias Boone the way people watched approaching storms out on the prairie, uncertain whether to feel curious or afraid. Every afternoon they sat beneath the same oil lamp inside Miller's saloon while dust drifted lazily through streaks of late sunlight and piano notes wandered softly through the room like tired memories. They still did not speak much. Sometimes 20 minutes passed with nothing exchanged except the sound of coffee cups touching old wood. Yet somehow the silence between them had become the loudest thing in town. Clara felt the weight of eyes everywhere now. At the feed store, at church, even crossing Main Street beneath the hanging signs swaying in warm wind. Women who once pitied her had started studying her differently. Sharper, more suspicious. Mrs. Hargrove from the bakery leaned close one morning while wrapping fresh bread in brown paper. "Folks say that Cowboy has been staying in the boarding house over by the creek," she whispered carefully. Clara kept her eyes on the bread. "People say many things. They say he follows you around town." Clara finally looked up then, calm enough to make the older woman uncomfortable. "Funny," she said softly. "I do not remember asking what people say." Mrs. Hargrove flushed red and suddenly became very interested in folding paper straight. Clara carried the bread outside beneath bright afternoon sun, but the conversation followed her all the way home. The Whitmore Ranch sat nearly 3 miles north of town, where open fields rolled wide beneath endless sky. Caleb had built the house himself 12 years earlier, long before loneliness settled into its walls. Some evenings Clara still caught herself expecting to hear his boots crossing the porch after sunset. But lately another sound had begun slipping into her thoughts instead. A quiet voice saying simple things beside a cup of coffee. A tired smile appearing for half a second beneath weathered eyes. It frightened her how quickly memory was making room for someone else. That evening she stood alone on the porch watching golden light fade across the pasture while horses moved slowly near the fence line. Wind stirred through tall grass, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant rain. Then she noticed movement near the north fence. Clara narrowed her eyes against the setting sun. Someone was out there repairing broken boards beside the creek. She grabbed her shawl and walked across the pasture carefully, boots brushing through grass almost knee-high after the storm earlier that week. As she got closer, recognition tightened unexpectedly in her chest. Elias Boone. He stood bent over the damaged fence line with his sleeves rolled back, rough hands steady against weathered wood, while his horse waited nearby beneath a cottonwood tree. Clara stopped several feet away. "What are you doing?" Elias glanced over his shoulder calmly. "Fence looked ready to fall. So you decided to fix it?" "Looked easier than watching your cattle wander into the hills." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You could have asked first." Elias hammered another nail carefully into place before answering. "Would you have said yes?" Clara opened her mouth, then closed it again because the answer probably would have been no. Elias wiped dust from his hands slowly and leaned back against the fence post. Evening sunlight painted gold across the tired lines of his face. Your north pasture gate drags too, he said casually. Hinge needs replacing before winter. Clara crossed her arms. You always walk around fixing things that do not belong to you. Elias shrugged. Depends who they belong to. The answer landed softly, but stayed with her long after silence returned between them. Wind moved gently through the pasture, while somewhere far off a meadowlark called across the hills. Clara noticed Elias looked strangely peaceful out here away from town gossip and crowded saloons. Less guarded somehow. You should not be helping me, she said quietly after a while. Why not? Because people are talking. Elias picked up another board calmly. People talked before I got here. Clara looked toward the horizon where sunset burned deep orange across endless prairie. Not like this. Elias studied her for a long moment before speaking. Does it bother you? She wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell him he was making life harder. Complicated. Dangerous for a woman who had spent 2 years building careful walls around her grief. But standing there watching him repair broken wood beneath fading sunlight, Clara realized something painful. The gossip did not bother her nearly as much as the possibility of Elias leaving. It should, she admitted softly. Elias nodded once like a man who understood more than she had actually said aloud. He returned to work without pressing further. That was his way, never chasing answers people were not ready to give. Clara remained there beside the fence much longer than necessary, listening to the steady rhythm of hammer against wood while evenings settled around them slow and quiet. For the first time since Caleb died, the ranch no longer felt entirely empty at sunset. Then from the hill overlooking the pasture came the distant sound of another horse approaching. Clara turned sharply. Walter Graves rode down toward them wearing a dark coat despite the heat. Expression stiff the moment he spotted Elias standing beside her fence. The banker slowed his horse near the gate, eyes moving from Clara to the repaired boards and back again. Interesting sight, Walter said coldly. Cowboy doing ranch work now. Elias remained calm. Fence needed fixing. Walter gave a dry laugh. And I suppose you volunteered out of pure kindness. Clara heard the accusation beneath his words immediately. Walter believed every man wanted something from her. Truth was, most of them did. But Elias had never once asked for land, money, affection, or promises. That unsettled Walter more than if he had. What do you want, Walter? Clara asked tiredly. Walter kept his gaze fixed on Elias. Just making sure strangers understand their place around here. Elias rested one arm across the fence post casually. Still trying to figure out my place myself. Walter's jaw tightened. Men without roots tend to disappear quickly. Maybe, Elias answered quietly. But sometimes roots are the very thing keeping folks trapped. Silence spread across the pasture after that. Heavy. Dangerous in a way words alone rarely became. Walter looked toward Clara again, and for one brief moment, she saw something wounded behind his anger. Not love exactly. Pride. A man used to losing attention. Finally, he pulled sharply on the reins. Careful who you trust, Clara, he muttered before turning his horse back toward town. Dust rose behind him as he rode away beneath deepening twilight. Clara stood still beside the fence listening until hoofbeats disappeared completely. Then she looked back toward Elias. He had already returned quietly to repairing the gate hinge, like nothing important had happened at all. And somehow that simple thing touched her more deeply than grand speeches ever could. Some people fall in love with grand gestures. Clara Whitmore began falling for a man because he repaired a gate without asking for credit. That truth unsettled her more with every passing day. Autumn slowly crept across the valley outside Dry Creek, painting the cottonwood trees pale gold along the creek beds while colder winds swept dust across the open plains by late afternoon. The nights grew quieter too. Longer. Clara noticed those changes because she had started measuring her days differently now. Not by chores or weather or loneliness. By whether Elias Boone would appear before sunset. And he always did. Sometimes he arrived carrying fresh-cut firewood for the saloon owner after helping stack lumber behind the stable. Other times he came smelling of horses and river water after spending the morning assisting ranch hands outside town. Yet no matter where he had been, he always returned to the same chair beside Clara beneath the oil lamp. Never demanding conversation. Never pushing for more than she was willing to give. That patience slowly wore down Wall's grief had spent 2 years building. One cold evening the wind arrived hard from the north, rattling windows all across town, while dark clouds swallowed the sunset early. Clara reached Miller's saloon just before rain started falling in sharp silver streaks across Main Street. The place was crowded with ranchers escaping the storm, boots muddy and shoulders damp beneath heavy coats. The piano struggled against the noise of thunder overhead, while lantern light flickered gold against smoke-stained walls. Clara stepped inside, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and immediately searched the room without meaning to. Elias was not there. Strange how disappointment could arrive so quickly now. She sat alone beneath the oil lamp, pretending not to notice the empty chair beside her again. But tonight the chair felt wrong. Too familiar. Too much like the old days she no longer wanted returning. Walter Graves noticed her sitting alone almost immediately. He crossed the room carrying 2 glasses and stopped beside her table with polished confidence. "Evening, Clara," he said smoothly. "Storm is getting ugly out there." Clara nodded once without looking up. Walter set 1 glass near her hand. "Thought maybe you should not spend another night alone." Clara stared at the whiskey for several quiet seconds before gently pushing it back toward him. "I was not aware I asked for company." Walter sighed heavily and lowered himself into a nearby chair anyway. "This town is talking about you," he said. "About him?" Clara kept her eyes on the rain streaking down the windows. "Town has little else to entertain itself with." "You know nothing about that cowboy." "Neither do you." Walter leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Men like Elias Boone drift from place to place because they cannot build anything worth staying for." The words struck harder than Clara expected because somewhere deep down she feared they might be true. Elias belonged to Rhodes. To distance. To disappearing. She hated herself for caring. Before she could answer, the saloon door burst open beneath a rush of cold wind and rain. Elias stepped inside, soaked from head to boots, water dripping steadily from the brim of his hat onto the wooden floor. Conversations around the room softened almost immediately. Clara looked up too fast again. Elias spotted her at once. Then his eyes shifted toward Walter sitting beside her table. Something unreadable crossed his face before disappearing just as quickly. Walter stood slowly, smoothing his expensive coat with satisfaction. "Looks like your drifter finally made it through the storm," he muttered. Elias approached calmly, removing his wet gloves 1 finger at a time. "Evening," he said quietly. Clara noticed the damp strands of hair falling near his forehead and the exhaustion in his eyes. "You are soaked," she said before thinking. Elias glanced toward the storm outside. "Road south washed out. Took longer getting back." "Back." The words settled warmly inside her chest before she could stop it. Walter noticed too. "Funny," the banker said dryly. "You speak about Dry Creek like it belongs to you now." Elias rested 1 hand against the back of the empty chair beside Clara. "No," he answered softly. "Just sounds better than most places." Silence spread briefly through the saloon. Walter looked between them and finally understood something painful. Clara was no longer merely tolerating the cowboy. She cared whether he returned. That realization hardened his face. "You are making a mistake," Walter told her quietly. "Men who wander eventually keep wandering." Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward him. "Then maybe the problem is not the wandering." Walter stared at her as if he barely recognized the woman speaking anymore. Then without another word, he grabbed his coat and disappeared back into the storm. Elias remained standing beside the table another second. "I can leave if you want," he said quietly. Clara looked toward the empty chair. The same chair she once guarded like sacred ground. Then she looked back at him. "Sit down, Elias." He obeyed without another word. Rain hammered the saloon roof harder now, while thunder rolled deep enough to shake glasses behind the bar. Elias rubbed warmth back into his hands near the lantern light. Clara noticed his knuckles looked scraped and raw from working outdoors all day. "You should not ride in weather like this," she murmured. Elias gave a faint shrug. "Storms do not usually wait for permission." Clara stared at him for a long moment before softly asking, "Why do you keep coming back here?" Elias seemed surprised by the question. He looked down into his coffee while the storm roared outside around them. When he finally answered, his voice carried the kind of honesty people only speak when they are too tired to hide anymore. "Because this is the first place in a long time that feels quiet inside my head." Clara felt something tighten painfully in her chest at those words. Not romance exactly. Recognition. 2 lonely people discovering the same silence. Neither of them spoke again for a while after that. They simply listened to rain striking the windows while lantern light flickered softly across the table between them. And somewhere beyond the storm, without either of them realizing it yet, Dry Creek had already started choosing sides. Thank you for staying with this story until now. The hardest thing about healing is that at first it feels exactly like betrayal. Clara Whitmore understood that now every time she caught herself smiling before remembering she was not supposed to anymore. October settled fully over Dry Creek, bringing colder mornings and long amber sunsets that stretched across the prairie like fading fire. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned almost completely gold, and every gust of wind sent leaves spinning through town like little pieces of old memory breaking loose. Clara noticed beauty again lately. That frightened her. For 2 years after Caleb died, the world had looked colorless no matter the season. Now she found herself watching sunlight on windows, listening to piano music longer than necessary, waiting for footsteps outside the saloon door every afternoon. She hated how easily Elias Boone had become part of her days. More than that, she hated how much she feared losing him already. One evening she arrived at Miller's saloon earlier than usual and found the place nearly empty except for the bartender wiping glasses behind the counter. Rain clouds gathered low outside, turning the windows gray with approaching dusk. Clara sat beneath the oil lamp alone, removing her gloves slowly while silence wrapped around the room. The empty chair beside her no longer felt haunted these days. It felt occupied even before Elias arrived. That realization stayed heavy in her chest. "You are early," came Elias's voice from behind her. Clara turned quickly. He stood near the doorway carrying a small paper bundle beneath one arm, coat dusted lightly with flour. "What is that?" she asked. Elias walked over calmly and set the bundle on the table between them. "Peach pie from the bakery." Clara blinked in surprise. "You bought pie?" Mrs. Hargrove burned the first batch. Felt bad nobody was buying the second. Clara stared at him for a moment before quietly laughing beneath her breath. "That may be the saddest reason anyone has ever given me pie." Elias sat beside her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Still pie." She opened the paper carefully. Warm cinnamon and baked peaches drifted upward between them. Such a simple thing. Yet Clara could not remember the last time someone brought her something without expecting anything in return. Not flowers, not jewelry, not promises. Just pie because the day felt cold. They shared it slowly while evening settled outside the windows. Elias ate quietly, never speaking with his mouth full, another small old-fashioned habit that somehow softened him further in Clara's eyes. After a while she noticed his left hand resting near the coffee cup. A pale scar crossed the base of his thumb, disappearing beneath his sleeve. "What happened there?" she asked gently. Elias glanced down at the scar like he had forgotten it existed. "Wagon fire years ago." Clara waited. He usually stopped talking after short answers. Tonight he did not. "Wool snapped crossing dry country south of Abilene." He continued quietly. Lantern tipped over during the night. His voice remained calm, but Clara noticed the way his fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. Could not get everybody out in time. Silence settled between them heavier than before. Rain began tapping softly against the windows outside. Clara looked at the scar again, suddenly understanding something important. Elias Boone carried grief the same way she did. Quietly, like a wound hidden beneath clothing that never fully healed no matter how many miles a man traveled. "Family?" she asked softly. Elias nodded once. No details. No dramatic story. Somehow that single movement carried more sadness than words ever could. Clara lowered her eyes toward the pie between them. "I used to think surviving was the hard part," she admitted after a while. Elias stared out at the rain. "It is not." No, Clara's voice almost disappeared beneath the storm outside. "It is staying after." Elias looked at her then. Truly looked at her. Not at the widow everyone in Dry Creek whispered about. Not at the beautiful ranch owner men competed for. Just at Clara. And for one terrifying second, she felt completely seen. "That is why you keep the chair," he said quietly. Clara's breath caught. Nobody had ever asked directly. Nobody dared. "At first I kept it because I thought if I moved on too quickly," she stopped herself. Elias waited patiently. "Because I thought loving life again meant I did not love him enough." Rain struck harder against the roof now, while lantern light flickered gold across the table. Elias listened without interruption. No advice. No pity. Only understanding. "But grief is strange," Clara whispered. After a while, you stop holding onto the memory because of love. Her eyes drifted toward the empty space beside the table. You hold on to it because you are afraid there will be nothing left if you let go. Elias sat very still after that. Then slowly, carefully, like a man approaching wounded ground, he reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table beside her coffee cup. A small silver pocket watch. Old. Scratched. The chain broken near the clasp. Clara looked at him questioningly. It belonged to my wife, Elias said softly. Stopped working the night she died. Clara touched the watch carefully with trembling fingertips. Why are you showing me this? Elias stared down at the silent watch for a long moment before answering. Because carrying broken things too long gets heavy. The words settled deep inside her chest where loneliness had lived for years. Clara suddenly realized this was the first honest conversation she had shared with anyone since Caleb's funeral. Not because others never tried, because nobody else understood silence the way Elias did. Outside, thunder rolled low across the prairie while rain blurred the world beyond the saloon windows into streaks of silver and shadow. Inside, beneath the oil lamp, two grieving people sat, quietly beside cold coffee and half-eaten pie, understanding each other without needing many words at all. Then Clara did something she had not done in over 2 years. Slowly, almost nervously, she slipped the silver wedding ring from her finger and set it gently beside her cup. Not hidden away, not discarded, just resting there for the first time in years. Elias noticed immediately, but said nothing. That silence meant more to Clara than any speech possibly could. Because some men would have celebrated the moment. Elias simply respected it. And somewhere beyond the rain and lantern glow and tired old grief, Clara Whitmore finally began understanding the difference between replacing love and making room for life again. People in small towns can forgive almost anything except happiness returning to someone they already buried in their minds. By November, Dry Creek no longer whispered about Clara Whitmore and Elias Boone quietly. The gossip had grown teeth. It followed Clara through church aisles, across the feed store porch, into the silence after conversations stopped when she entered a room. Some women looked at her with disappointment now, as if widowhood carried rules she had begun breaking. Others looked almost jealous, though few would ever admit it aloud. A grieving woman was acceptable. A healing one unsettled everybody. Clara felt it everywhere. Yet each afternoon she still found herself walking toward Miller's saloon beneath the fading gold light of autumn, knowing Elias would already be there waiting beside the oil lamp with 2 cups of coffee and that steady quietness she had come to rely on more than she should. One afternoon she arrived to find him carving something small from a piece of cedar wood with a pocket knife. His weathered hands moved carefully beneath the lantern glow, while piano music drifted softly through the room. "What is that?" Clara asked as she sat beside him. Elias turned the wood over once. "Not sure yet. Seems like a strange thing not to know before carving." Elias smiled faintly without looking up. "Some things become themselves while you work on them." Clara rested her gloves beside the coffee cup. "That sounds suspiciously wise for a drifter." "Do not spread it around town," he replied. "I got a reputation for silence to maintain." She laughed softly before she could stop herself again. The sound drew glances from nearby tables immediately. Clara noticed them this time. So did Elias. But neither mentioned it. He simply continued carving while she watched the small curls of cedar gather across the tabletop. "You ever stay anywhere long?" she asked after a while. Elias paused briefly before answering. "Longest was Montana. About 11 months. Why leave?" He shrugged lightly. "One morning I woke up, and everything started feeling familiar." Clara frowned slightly. "That sounds like a good thing." Elias looked toward the saloon windows where cold wind rattled faintly outside. "Depends what familiar reminds you of." Before Clara could ask more, the front doors opened hard enough to swing against the wall. Walter Graves stepped inside wearing a dark wool coat with 2 businessmen following close behind. Their polished boots and expensive jackets looked almost ridiculous beside the ranch hands and cowboys crowded around the saloon. Conversations softened immediately. Walter scanned the room until his eyes landed on Clara and Elias seated together again. His expression tightened. Clara felt the mood shift around them instantly. Elias continued carving quietly like nothing had changed. Walter crossed the room slowly, stopping beside their table beneath the oil lamp. "Mrs. Whitmore," he greeted stiffly. "Cowboy." Elias tipped his head politely. Banker. One of the businessmen behind Walter smirked at that. Walter ignored it. His eyes moved toward the silver wedding ring no longer resting on Clara's finger. Something dark flickered across his face before he masked it again. Interesting crowd you keep these days, he said quietly. Clara reached for her coffee calmly. You came over here to discuss my company? I came over here because this town still has standards. Silence spread across the nearby tables. Elias slowly set the carving knife down beside the cedar wood. Sounds serious, he said calmly. Walter leaned one hand against the table. You drift into town with no land, no business, no family. And suddenly you are sitting beside one of the most respected women in Dry Creek, like you belong there. Elias met his stare evenly. She never seemed to mind. A few men near the poker table coughed into their drinks, trying to hide grins. Walter's face reddened slightly. Clara set her coffee cup down with careful precision. Walter, she said quietly, you are embarrassing yourself. The words landed harder than any raised voice could have. Walter stared at her in disbelief. I am embarrassing myself. He glanced around the room sharply. This entire town sees what is happening except you. Clara folded her hands in her lap. Then perhaps the town should mind its own business. One of the businessmen shifted awkwardly beside Walter. The tension in the saloon had grown thick enough to feel in the air now. But Elias remained calm. That almost seemed to anger Walter more than defiance would have. Men like him do not stay. Walter snapped quietly toward Clara. You think he is different because he listens to your sadness over coffee? Clara looked toward Elias for half a second before returning her eyes to Walter. No, she answered softly. I think he is different because he never once asked me to stop grieving. The room went silent after that. Even Walter seemed caught off guard. Elias lowered his eyes toward the unfinished cedar carving in his hands. Clara could tell the words affected him more deeply than he would ever admit aloud. Walter stood frozen for another long moment before straightening his coat sharply. You are making a mistake, he muttered. Clara's voice remained calm. Then let it be mine. Walter stared at her one final time before turning and walking toward the back of the saloon with his businessmen following close behind. Conversation slowly resumed afterward, though quieter now. Different. Dry Creek had just witnessed something important. Clara Whitmore had finally chosen a side. Elias picked up the cedar carving again after several silent seconds. You did not have to do that, he said softly. Clara looked at him carefully. Yes, she replied. I did. Elias studied her face for a long moment beneath the lantern. Light. Then slowly he turned the small cedar carving toward her. Clara blinked in surprise. It was a chair. Tiny. Hand-carved. One leg slightly uneven, but recognizable all the same. Her breath caught softly in her chest. Elias, he rubbed his thumb along the cedar wood almost nervously. Thought maybe every chair deserves somebody willing to stay a while. Clara stared at the tiny carving while warmth and grief and fear tangled painfully together inside her chest. Because for the first time since Caleb died, someone had not tried to replace the empty space in her life. Elias Boone had simply sat beside it long enough for her not to feel alone anymore. The first real sign that a heart is changing is not love. It is habit. Clara Whitmore realized that on a cold Tuesday morning when she poured 2 cups of coffee at home before remembering Elias Boone was not there. She stood alone in her kitchen staring at the extra cup while pale winter sunlight stretched across the wooden floorboards Caleb once built with his own hands. Outside, frost silvered the pasture fences and smoke drifted lazily from the chimney into sharp November air. For 2 years, every object inside the house had belonged to memory. Lately, some of them had started belonging to tomorrow instead. That frightened her more than loneliness ever did. She poured the second cup back into the pot slowly and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Then she noticed something strange. The chair at her kitchen table no longer looked empty in a painful way. It looked expectant. By afternoon, the cold had settled deep across Dry Creek. Horses exhaled white breath into the air while ranch hands stamped boots against frozen boards outside the saloon. Clara arrived carrying a basket of fresh bread from the bakery, cheeks pink from wind, and immediately spotted Elias seated beneath the oil lamp as usual. But something felt different today. He looked distant. Not unhappy exactly, just farther away somehow. His hat rested low near his eyes and his coffee had gone untouched long enough to cool. Clara slid quietly into the chair beside him. You look like somebody stole your horse, she murmured. Elias glanced up. Slowly. Horse is still there. Then what is wrong? He rubbed one rough hand against his jaw before answering. Nothing worth speaking on. Clara studied him carefully. Over the past few weeks, she had learned the difference between Elias's ordinary silence and the silence he used to hide from himself. This was the second kind. Outside, wind scraped dry leaves across Main Street, while lanterns flickered weakly against the gray afternoon. Inside, the saloon conversations drifted low around them. Clara pushed the basket of bread gently toward him. Mrs. Hargrove burned another pie, she said softly. Thought bread felt safer. That finally earned the smallest hint of a smile. Town may never recover from her baking. Clara relaxed slightly, seeing warmth return to his face. Elias reached into the basket and tore off a piece of bread slowly. Then his eyes drifted toward the window again. Clara followed his gaze. A stagecoach had just rolled into town through the cold dust outside. Travelers stepped down bundled in heavy coats, while horses snorted steam into the frozen air. Nothing unusual. Yet Elias watched them with a heaviness Clara did not understand. You know somebody? She asked carefully. He shook his head. No, but the answer came too quickly. Clara noticed. She always noticed now. Before she could press further, Sheriff Tom Avery entered the saloon carrying a folded telegram in one hand. The sheriff spotted Elias immediately and crossed the room. Boone, he said quietly. Elias looked up. Tom handed him the telegram without another word. Clara saw something flicker across Elias's expression the moment he read it. Not fear. Weariness. The kind a man feels when the road catches up to him again. Bad news. Clara asked softly after the sheriff walked away. Elias folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Just news. That usually means bad. Elias stared down into his untouched coffee for several long seconds before finally speaking. Friend of mine out near Cheyenne passed on last week. Clara lowered her eyes gently. I am sorry. Elias nodded once. Had a small cattle spread. No family left. Guess they wanted me to know. Clara heard the unspoken thing beneath his words immediately. Another reminder that people disappear. Another reason not to stay attached anywhere too long. Were you close? She asked. Elias gave a faint shrug. Close enough to remember each other. The answer settled heavily between them. Clara suddenly understood something painful about men like Elias Boone. Wandering was not freedom for him. It was survival. If he never stayed long enough to belong somewhere, maybe losing people hurt less. Yet sitting beside him now, Clara knew that was no longer true. He already belonged here more than he realized. A few moments later, Walter Graves entered the saloon, speaking loudly with two ranchers near the doorway. He noticed Clara and Elias immediately. His expression darkened when he saw how close they sat now without hesitation. No empty chair between them anymore. Clara saw it too. The realization struck her suddenly enough to steal her breath for half a second. Somewhere along the way, the symbolic distance she once guarded had quietly disappeared. Walter approached slowly. Afternoon, he greeted stiffly. Clara nodded politely. Elias tipped his hat once, but remained silent. Walter glanced toward the untouched coffee in front of Elias. Cowboy looks troubled today. Clara's voice cooled instantly. Walter. But Walter ignored the warning. Truth is, Clara, drifters always carry storms behind them. That is why they keep moving. Elias remained calm. Sometimes. Walter folded his arms. And sometimes they leave before decent people realize who they really are. The room softened around them again. Folks nearby listened carefully without pretending otherwise now. Elias finally looked up. You got something particular to say? Walter held his gaze. Only that men without roots usually got reasons for it. Silence stretched tight across the saloon. Clara looked toward Elias expecting irritation, anger, anything. Instead, he simply leaned back slightly and gave the faintest tired smile. You ever notice, he said quietly, how folks with everything still spend most of their time worrying about other people? A few ranch hands near the bar lowered their heads to hide grins. Walter's face reddened. Clara could feel the tension tightening again. But before the banker could answer, Elias slowly stood from the table for the first time all afternoon. Excuse me, he said softly toward Clara. Then he walked outside into the cold without another word. Clara watched the saloon doors swing shut behind him while unease settled deep inside her chest. Something was wrong. More wrong than a telegram or old memories. She could feel it in the way Elias moved today, like a man already halfway gone before his boots ever reached the road. Walter noticed her concern immediately. That is the problem with men like him, he muttered quietly. You never know when they are about to disappear. Clara turned slowly toward him then, and for the first time since Caleb died, another man's opinion no longer mattered to her at all. Because the only thing she could think about was the look in Elias Boone's eyes when he walked out into the cold alone. The cruelest part about caring for someone is realizing how quickly fear begins disguising itself as anger. Clara Whitmore rode home from town that evening beneath a sky the color of cold iron, unable to shake the image of Elias Boone walking out of Miller's saloon with that distant look still sitting behind his eyes. The wind had turned sharp enough to sting now, carrying winter down from the northern plains earlier than usual. Dry grass bent low across the open pasture around her ranch, while fence posts groaned softly in the cold. Everything felt restless. Even the horses seemed uneasy. Clara barely slept that night. She lay awake listening to branches scrape against the roof while shadows from the dying fireplace stretched long across the bedroom walls. More than once, she almost convinced herself she was being foolish. Elias was a grown man. Cowboys disappeared all the time. Roads called to people like him the same way oceans called to sailors. Yet sometime near dawn she finally admitted the truth she had been avoiding for weeks now. If Elias Boone left Dry Creek, it would hurt. Deeply. That realization sat heavy in her chest long after sunrise. The next afternoon she arrived at Miller's saloon earlier than usual. Again, snow clouds gathered low over town, swallowing most of the light before evening even arrived. The saloon smelled of coffee, wet wool coats, and burning wood from the iron stove near the back wall. Clara looked immediately toward the oil lamp table. Empty. Her stomach tightened. She sat down slowly, removing her gloves one finger at a time while trying not to stare at the door every few seconds. 1 hour passed. Then another. The coffee in front of her cooled untouched. Around her, conversations drifted low and ordinary while poker chips clicked against old tables. But Clara heard none of it clearly. All she could hear was Walter Graves' voice from the day before. Men like him do not stay. She hated how much the words frightened her now. Just after sunset, the saloon doors finally opened beneath a rush of cold wind and scattered snowflakes. Elias stepped inside, carrying a saddlebag over one shoulder. Clara's chest tightened instantly at the sight of it. He spotted her immediately, though his expression remained unreadable. Quiet. Tired. The kind of tired that reaches deeper than sleep. Elias walked toward the table slowly and set the saddlebag near his boots before sitting beside her. You are late, Clara said softly. Had things to settle. Her eyes drifted toward the bag. Leaving. Elias rubbed warmth back into his hands before answering. Thinking about it. The honesty of it struck harder than excuses would have. Clara looked down at the untouched coffee between them, suddenly afraid to raise her eyes again because she knew he would see too much there. Because of Walter? She asked quietly. Elias shook his head once. No, then why? He stared toward the snow beginning to collect outside the windows. Because staying somewhere starts costing more after a while. Clara understood immediately. Not money. Attachment. Loss. Hope. The dangerous things. You think leaving hurts less? She whispered. Elias smiled faintly, though sadness rested behind it. No, his voice dropped lower. Just usually hurts slower. Silence settled heavily between them. Around the saloon, people sensed something shifting at the oil lamp table again. Clara could feel curious. Glances drifting toward them from nearby chairs. She no longer cared. You told me once, she said carefully, that carrying broken things too long gets heavy. Elias nodded slightly. It does. Clara finally looked directly at him then. So why are you still carrying yourself like something already lost? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Elias leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on the floorboards beneath the table for several seconds before answering. Because every place I ever tried staying eventually turned into another thing I had to bury. Clara felt her throat tighten painfully. She reached instinctively toward the tiny cedar chair he had carved for her weeks earlier, still resting safely inside her coat pocket. She carried it everywhere now without telling him. Dry Creek is not asking you to bury anything, she murmured. Elias looked at her then with an expression so open and tired it almost broke her heart. That is exactly what makes it dangerous. Snow tapped softly against the saloon windows while lantern light flickered gold across his weathered face. Clara suddenly understood the terrible loneliness of men like Elias Boone. Some people feared love because they had never found it. Elias feared it because he already had, and losing it once had nearly hollowed him out completely. Before Clara could answer, laughter burst loudly from the back tables where Walter Graves sat drinking with several businessmen again. The banker glanced toward them and immediately noticed the saddlebag near Elias's boots. A slow satisfaction crossed his face. He stood and walked over carrying a whiskey glass loosely in one hand. "Well now," Walter said smoothly. "Looks like the cowboy finally remembered he has somewhere else to be." Clara's jaw tightened instantly. Elias remained calm. "Evening, Walter." Walter ignored him, eyes settling instead on the saddlebag. "Roads get cold this time of year. Best leave before the snow traps you somewhere permanent." Clara looked toward Walter sharply. "Enough." But the banker kept going. "Truth is, Clara, men who spend their lives wandering usually do so because nobody ever needed them enough to stay." The words hung ugly in the air between them. Several nearby conversations stopped completely now. Elias lowered his eyes toward his coffee cup, silent again in that dangerous way Clara had come to recognize. Not weak. Wounded. Something inside her finally snapped quietly into place then. Clara stood slowly from the table beneath every watching eye in the saloon. Walter seemed surprised by the movement. So did Elias. Clara looked directly at the banker, voice steady enough to cut through the entire room without needing volume. "Do you know the difference between you and him?" Walter frowned slightly. Clara glanced toward Elias beside her before answering. "You keep trying to convince me to choose you." Then her eyes returned coldly to Walter. He never once asked. Silence swallowed the room whole. Walter stared at her as if she had struck him across the face. Elias looked up slowly, something almost painful flickering behind his eyes now. Clara reached down then, and without hesitation pulled the saddlebag away from beside Elias's boots. She set it gently beneath the table out of reach. A small movement. Quiet. Yet somehow it changed everything. Because for the first time since Caleb Whitmore died, Clara was no longer waiting for somebody to leave her. She was asking someone to stay. Snow arrived 3 days later and covered Dry Creek in the kind of silence only winter can bring. The roofs turned white overnight. Wagon tracks disappeared beneath fresh powder before noon. Smoke curled slowly from chimneys into pale gray skies while horses stood huddled together against the cold, near-frozen hitching posts. Everything in town moved slower now. Softer. Even gossip lost some of its sharpness beneath winter weather. But inside Clara Whitmore's chest, nothing felt quiet anymore. Ever since she pulled Elias Boone's saddlebag away from the door and asked him to stay without actually speaking the words aloud, something had changed between them. Not dramatic. Not sudden, just honest now. Dangerous in its honesty. Elias still came to Miller's saloon every afternoon. Still sat beside her beneath the oil lamp with coffee warming his rough hands while piano music drifted lazily through the room. Yet, the silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt lived in, familiar, like two people slowly building something neither quite knew how to name. One evening Clara arrived carrying a thick wool scarf folded carefully over one arm. Wind had turned bitter outside, sharp enough to sting exposed skin within minutes. Elias already sat at their table watching snow drift across Main Street through the frosted windows. Clara noticed immediately he was not wearing gloves again despite the weather. "You are going to lose fingers one day," she muttered softly while taking her seat. Elias glanced toward his bare hands. "Still got most of them." Clara shook her head faintly and slid the wool scarf across the table toward him. "Mrs. Hargrove traded me too much fabric last month." Elias looked at the scarf but did not touch it immediately. Dark gray wool, hands stitched around the edges. Simple, practical, the kind of gift-carrying care without performance. "You made this?" he asked quietly. Clara pretended sudden interest in her coffee cup. "It gets cold out there." Elias stared at the scarf for several seconds before finally lifting it carefully in both hands. Something unreadable crossed his tired face then. Not surprise exactly. Something deeper. The kind of emotion lonely people forget how to react to properly. "Nobody has given me something handmade in a very long time," he admitted softly. Clara's chest tightened painfully at the honesty in his voice. "Well," she murmured, "someone should have." Elias looked at her then in a way that made the entire crowded saloon seem to disappear around them. Quiet, steady, grateful enough to almost hurt. Before either could speak again, the church bell outside rang 6 times through the snowy evening. Clara glanced toward the frosted windows. You going back to the boarding house tonight? Elias hesitated briefly. Probably. Clara stirred her coffee slowly. Road to town is getting worse. I noticed. My ranch house has 3 empty rooms. The words slipped out before fear could stop them. Silence settled instantly between them. Even the piano seemed farther away now. Elias stared at her carefully, almost cautiously, as though afraid he misunderstood. Clara felt warmth rush into her cheeks despite the cold. I only mean, she struggled awkwardly for calmer words. Winter storms trap folks out here sometimes. And the boarding house roof leaks. Elias still said nothing for several seconds. Then finally he lowered his eyes toward the scarf resting in his hands. Clara, just her name. Yet somehow the way he spoke it carried more emotion than most men managed with entire speeches. Clara swallowed hard. You do not have to answer now. Elias leaned back slowly, weathered fingers tracing the edge of the scarf. You sure you know what you are asking? The question settled heavily between them. Because they both understood this was no longer about weather or empty rooms or leaking roofs. Inviting someone into your home after grief had hollowed it out carried meaning deeper than romance. It meant trust, presence, hope, dangerous things. Clara looked down briefly at the tiny cedar chair resting safely inside her coat pocket before answering. I think I am tired of eating supper alone. Elias closed his eyes for one brief second after hearing that. When he opened them again, Clara saw something there she had not seen before. Fear. Real fear. Not of her. Of wanting to stay. You make this difficult, he said quietly. Clara almost smiled. Funny. I was about to say the same thing. Snow continued falling outside, while lantern light flickered warmly across the saloon walls. Around them folks drank coffee, played cards, laughed softly at distant tables. Yet beneath the oil lamp the world had narrowed down to 2 lonely people sitting dangerously close to choosing each other. Then the saloon doors burst open beneath another sweep of cold wind. Sheriff Tom Avery stepped inside brushing snow from his coat. He spotted Clara and Elias immediately and crossed toward them with a folded newspaper tucked beneath one arm. Evening, Tom greeted quietly. Then his eyes shifted between them before settling on Elias. Stagecoach came through from Cheyenne this morning. Elias nodded once. I heard. Tom hesitated briefly before placing the newspaper on the table. Clara noticed an article circled in dark ink near the bottom of the page. Elias looked at it, but did not reach for it. Thought maybe you should know, Tom said softly. Then the sheriff walked away again toward the stove near the bar. Clara glanced toward the paper. What is it? Elias rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. Nothing important. Clara gently pulled the newspaper closer anyway. Her eyes moved across the circled article. A small piece about a ranch fire outside Cheyenne years earlier. Survivors listed. Casualties listed. Then she saw the name. Abigail Boone. Clara looked up slowly. Elias stared toward the snow outside the windows, jaw tight beneath tired eyes. Your wife, Clara whispered. Elias nodded once. Silence settled again. Heavy now? Clara looked back toward the article and noticed something else beside Abigail Boone's name. One child. Samuel Boone. Age 6. Clara's breath caught softly. Elias had never mentioned a child before. He remained very still beside her, eyes fixed on the storm outside town. I could not save either of them, he said quietly. The words came flat and exhausted, worn thin by years of carrying them alone. Clara felt her heart break silently beside him then, not because of the tragedy itself, because suddenly every mile Elias Boone had ridden across the country finally made sense. He was not running from places. He was running from the unbearable weight of staying alive after people you love are gone. Clara slowly reached across the table, then, and rested her hand gently over his. Elias froze beneath the touch. For one long moment, neither of them moved at all while snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows and lantern light flickered gold against weathered wood. Then slowly, almost carefully, Elias turned his hand beneath hers and held on. The snowstorm arrived harder than anyone expected. By the next evening, the roads outside Dry Creek had nearly vanished beneath drifts piling waist deep along the open prairie, and wind screamed across the valley hard enough to shake windows inside every building in town. Ranchers rushed livestock into barns before dark while lanterns glowed late across frozen fields. Clara Whitmore stood alone on her porch watching white snow spin through the night like ghost smoke beneath the moonlight, her wool coat pulled tightly around her shoulders against the bitter cold. Somewhere beyond the storm, Elias Boone was still at the boarding house packing the few belongings he carried through life inside one worn saddlebag. The thought hollowed her chest in a way she could no longer deny. She had spent 2 years surviving silence. Now she feared returning to it. Inside the ranch house, fire crackled softly in the stone hearth while warm light stretched across the kitchen table Caleb once built by hand. Clara's eyes drifted toward the second chair sitting there now. Not empty anymore. Waiting. She stared at it for a long moment before finally grabbing her lantern and stepping back into the storm. Snow bit sharply against her face as she crossed the yard toward the barn. The horses shifted nervously inside while wind rattled the wooden walls hard enough to sound like distant thunder. Clara saddled her mare with stiff fingers despite the cold. Every sensible part of her new traveling into town tonight was foolish. Dangerous even. But some things become clearer during storms. Loneliness. Regret. Love. 20 minutes later she rode slowly through white darkness toward Dry Creek, lantern swinging beside the saddle, while snow swallowed nearly every sound except hoofbeats and wind. By the time she reached town, most buildings had gone dark for the night. Only Miller's saloon and the boarding house still glowed faintly beneath heavy snowfall. Clara tied her horse quickly outside the boarding house and hurried up the frozen steps. The old floorboards creaked beneath her boots as she entered. Warmth and the smell of wood smoke greeted her immediately. Miss Eleanor, the elderly woman who owned the place, looked up from her rocking chair beside the stove in surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you should not be out in this weather." Clara removed snow from her coat quickly. "Is Elias here?" The older woman nodded toward the staircase. "Room 7. Been pacing like a caged wolf all evening." Clara's heartbeat quickened painfully at those words. She climbed the narrow staircase slowly while wind howled. Outside the walls, light glowed faintly beneath the door at the end of the hallway. Room 7. Clara stood there for one long second, gathering courage she was not sure she possessed anymore. Then she knocked softly. Silence. Footsteps crossed the room. The door opened. Elias stood there wearing a plain white shirt with suspenders hanging loose at his sides, dark hair slightly damp from melted snow. Behind him the small room looked half-packed already. Saddlebag resting on the bed, coat folded neatly beside it. Clara felt her chest tighten instantly at the sight. Elias looked genuinely stunned to see her standing there. "Clara." Snowflakes melted slowly in her hair and along the shoulders of her coat, while cold air drifted between them from the hallway. "You were leaving," she said quietly. Elias rubbed one tired hand across his jaw. "I was thinking about it." That usually means yes. He looked away briefly toward the saddlebag before answering. "Safer that way." Clara stepped inside without asking permission and closed the door behind her against the storm. The room suddenly felt very small. Warm. Quiet except for the wind outside. Elias watched her carefully, uncertainty written across his weathered face. "You should not have come out in this weather," he murmured. Clara's eyes settled on the packed saddlebag again. "Neither should you." Silence stretched between them. Honest silence now. Dangerous because neither could hide inside it anymore. Finally, Clara removed her gloves slowly and placed them on the small table beside the lantern. "I spent 2 years believing my life ended when Caleb died," she said softly. Elias lowered his eyes toward the floorboards. "Clara." "No," she whispered gently. "You listen to me for once." The storm groaned against the windows while lantern light flickered softly across the room. Clara stepped closer. "Then you sat beside me one afternoon and never once asked me to stop grieving him." Elias looked up slowly. Pain rested openly in his eyes now. "Because I know what it costs." Clara nodded faintly. "Yes, you do." She swallowed hard before continuing. "But somewhere along the way, sitting beside you stopped feeling like betrayal." Elias's jaw tightened. "You do not owe me your heart, because I was lonely too." Clara shook her head immediately. "That is not what this is." She stepped closer again until only a few feet remained between them. "I am here because for the first time in years, I do not dread tomorrow anymore." Elias stared at her like the words physically hurt him. "Clara, I do not know how to stay. Her eyes softened then. Maybe nobody ever asked you to before. The room fell silent again except for the storm outside. Elias looked toward the packed saddlebag on the bed, then back at Clara standing there in the middle of winter with snow still melting from her coat, because she could not bear watching him disappear quietly into another horizon. You make this feel possible, he admitted softly. Clara's throat tightened. Good. Elias closed his eyes briefly, breathing slow like a man standing at the edge of something terrifying. When he looked at her again, all the distance he usually carried seemed suddenly exhausted. If I stay, he said quietly, I will mean it. Clara stepped forward then and gently took the wool scarf she made for him from the chair beside the bed. She wrapped it carefully around his neck with trembling fingers while lantern light glowed warm against the gray wool. Elias stood perfectly still beneath her touch. Then stay, she whispered. Neither of them moved after that. No dramatic kiss. No grand declaration. Just two tired people standing close together while snow buried the world outside, and something fragile finally stopped running inside both of them. Winter settled fully over Dry Creek after the storm, wrapping the valley in deep white silence that softened even the hardest parts of life. Snow rested heavy along rooftops and fence rails while smoke drifted slowly from chimneys into pale morning skies. The roads remained nearly buried for days, trapping most folks close to home with lantern light, coffee, and whatever company happened to share the cold with them. At the Whitmore Ranch, something quiet and impossible slowly began taking shape beneath all that snow. Elias Boone stayed, not because Clara begged him, not because he suddenly stopped fearing loss or learned how to outrun grief. He stayed because one lonely woman finally looked at a man built from leaving and calmly handed him a reason not to. The first morning he woke inside the ranch house, sunlight spilled gold across frost-covered windows, while the smell of coffee drifted softly from the kitchen downstairs. Elias sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment listening to the old house breathe around him. Floorboards creaked faintly. Wind brushed against the porch outside. Somewhere below, Clara moved quietly through the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Yet to a man who had spent years sleeping in boarding houses, wagons, and lonely camps beneath open sky, the simple feeling of another person waiting downstairs felt almost unbearable in its tenderness. He finally pulled on his boots and stepped into the hallway. Clara stood near the stove wearing a dark blue dress instead of black for the first time since Caleb died. Elias noticed immediately, but wisely said nothing. She glanced over as he entered. Coffee is getting cold, she murmured. Elias leaned one shoulder against the doorway, studying the warmth of the room around her. Seems familiar hearing that. Clara lowered her eyes briefly, hiding a smile inside the steam rising from her cup. The kitchen table sat near the frost-covered window where morning light stretched pale across the wood Caleb once sanded smooth with his own hands years earlier. 2 cups waited there now. 2 plates. 2 chairs pulled out beside each other. No empty seat left standing guard over grief anymore. Elias crossed the room slowly and sat down. For a while neither spoke. They simply listened to the quiet crackle of firewood in the stove while snow drifted lazily outside beyond the windows. Strange thing was, the silence no longer felt haunted. It felt peaceful. A few days later, Dry Creek finally dug itself free enough for wagons and horses to move through town again. By then, rumors had already spread faster than thawing snow. Clara Whitmore's porch light had stayed burning long after midnight during the storm. Elias Boone's horse remained tied outside her barn every morning since. People noticed such things. They always did. Yet when Clara and Elias finally rode into town together beneath pale winter sunlight, something unexpected happened. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered loud enough to matter. Folks simply watched quietly as the widow who once guarded her loneliness like sacred ground climbed down from her wagon, while the drifter beside her held the reins steady with one gloved hand. Even Walter Graves, standing outside the bank across the street, said nothing this time. He only looked tired suddenly. Older somehow. Clara noticed him watching from beneath the brim of his hat. For one brief second, she almost felt sorry for him. Then Elias touched her elbow gently while helping her step through the snow, and the feeling passed. That evening, Miller's saloon glowed warm against the cold night, while piano music drifted softly through the windows. Clara entered first, brushing snow from her coat, while familiar conversations softened around the room. Elias followed beside her, carrying the cedar carving of the tiny chair tucked carefully inside his coat pocket. They moved toward the oil lamp table automatically now. Habit. But when Clara reached the chair where she always sat, she paused unexpectedly. Elias noticed immediately. "Something wrong?" he asked quietly. Clara looked down at the table for a long moment before slowly shaking her head. Then, without speaking, she lifted the extra chair from beside the table and carried it across the room toward an empty corner near the wall. The entire saloon watched silently. She set the chair down there gently beside a small window where moonlight touched the wood. Not discarded, not forgotten, just no longer needed between them. Clara returned calmly afterward and sat beside Elias instead of across from him for the very first time. A strange quiet settled over the room then. Not awkward, respectful somehow. Like everybody understood they had just witnessed the end of something sad and the beginning of something honest. Elias looked toward her carefully beneath the lantern glow. "You sure about this?" he murmured softly. Clara glanced toward the old, empty chair resting peacefully across the room. Then she looked back at the cowboy, who spent months teaching her that healing did not mean betrayal and staying did not always end in loss. "No," she admitted quietly, "but I am sure about you." Elias lowered his eyes for half a second, like those words carried more weight than he knew how to hold. Then very gently he reached beneath the table and took her hand in his. No speeches followed. No dramatic moment. Just warmth. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Dry Creek while horses shifted beneath lantern light and smoke curled upward into the frozen night sky. Inside Miller's saloon, piano music drifted low through the warm air while two tired people sat quietly beside each other, no longer afraid of tomorrow. And over in the corner by the window, the old empty chair remained untouched beneath the moonlight. Not as a monument to grief anymore, just proof that love can survive silence without needing to stay lonely forever. Out on the frontier, justice did not always arrive with gunfire or badges or men demanding to be feared. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wearing a worn-out coat, carrying old scars, asking only one simple question before sitting beside someone broken long enough for both of them to heal. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.